So at this point now, we're really in the thick of it. We're really in the middle of the recession. And at this point, the government kind of steps in a little, in some way, it's maybe too little too late, and in some ways, maybe it's not. Um, but the first thing that really happens we're now in February of 2008, you see the housing market index. Um, I'm now showing two different metrics, right? I'm showing what was really going on in the forecast. Um, and what this is really showing you is that the housing board is maybe painting slightly bleaker a picture than what's really going on. But again, it's a forecast. You don't know what direction it's going to go until it really happens. Um, so the first thing that really happens is that the Fed reduces the national target interest rate from 5.25% to zero, to no interest at all. What is this interest rate? Um, this is the interest rate charged, and kind of the formal definition is that it's charged by one depository institution on an overnight sale of balances at the Fed to another institution. All that is saying is that if one bank, here's my bank, sells their loans or pays off their loans um, to another bank, right? Think about if you were to refinance your loans or consolidate your loans like we talked about, right? If you're going to pay off the balance of the loan with another loan, um, with a loan, right? So you go to this other bank and you say, "Hi, here's all my debt, but I'd like to consolidate it under you." Right? That bank turns around and says, "Well, sure, but here's my new interest rate." To do that, right? All of my balance becomes principal, but now my principal still has an interest that gets tacked on. Well, the Fed turned around and said, "Well, we're not going to do this. Um, to kind of help things out with the economy, we're going to drop this interest rate to zero." The point here is to encourage borrowing, to encourage investment again in the middle of, I say, a brewing crisis, but kind of right at the onset of the crisis looking back. And of course, we didn't know that then. Um, we thought we were kind of just about to go over the edge. It turned out we were kind of already there. Well, what happens next? Just to be clear, I'm in the same month. I'm in the same month. So what happens next is this didn't really help. President Bush turns around and signs the Economic Stimulus Act into law, also in February. So this does a lot of good, and a lot of good that might sound familiar now 12 years later. So the president then offered $600 to $1,200 tax rebates. There was a reduction in taxes, increased loan limits for kind of both of the major lending institutions. Fannie Mae, which, if I remember correctly, deals more with student loans, and then Freddie Mac, which we've talked about already. And the president really calls this a booster shot for the economy, right? If you think about getting a shot at the doctor, right, and you have to get one every year, right? This is meant to kind of inject a little more um, assistance into the economy just to try to keep it on its feet a little bit longer while we can really get our act together. Um, it's really an effort, an honest effort to keep the economy going, even if it's slowly. Right? It doesn't need to be the most um, robust economy right now, but it just needs to be enough to keep it from stopping altogether. There's a great, again, I'll post the link to these slides, but there's a great link here. There's a great video here um, where the president signs the act into law. He talks a little bit about what the act means. He gives this booster shot quote, but I think is kind of a fun thing, kind of an interesting thing is if you look into the um, list, into the crowd of people behind the president, you see um, figures like Mitch McConnell. You see figures um, that are still in the Senate today, and other senators who are still serving. So something I kind of thought was a little cool as somebody who's not really a historian, but I thought it was kind of interesting to see some of these figures that are still making kind of an impact on our government today. Were there when this first stimulus act was signed. So now we move into March, And you start to see the housing market index maybe start to plateau a little bit, hopefully, possibly. Um, you would think that, and then more giants fall. So first, starting with the banking giant Bear Stearns, and they're really one of the first ones, one of the major ones to start to actually blame their collapse on the subprime mortgage investments, to really turn around and say, this is why we're going down. JP Morgan steps in and acquires the assets lost by Bear Stearns. Following Bear Stearns was the Lehman Brothers. This was the largest bankruptcy filing in U.S. history. Um, Both events caused the Fed to panic, appropriately so, seeing two of um, your biggest giants, banking giants, fall. So they turn around and insure another banking giant, AIG, for $85 billion. And kind of doing this on the premise, on a phrase that would become all too common and all too famous for this recession. AIG was considered by the Fed to be too big to fail. Right, there's this belief that there's no way this massive lending institution that we've now guaranteed for $85 billion could possibly fail. It turns out too big to fail wasn't the case. It's really the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So there's actually a great movie called Too Big to Fail that talks about this crisis. Normally I would show this little clip in class, but I definitely encourage you to check it out for yourself. I think it's absolutely worth watching. It's an excellent summary so far of everything I've talked about in this PowerPoint up to this point. As is this New York Times article that really, well, they kind of bring up the question in the first place, right? Is too big to fail really too big to fail? And you see right in the article that these mortgage giants couldn't possibly be allowed to fail because they're putting a lot of stock, no pun intended, right? They're putting a lot of trust in these mortgage giants. If I've got all of this faith in this company, there's no way it could possibly go under. Well, the problem with that line of thinking is that you have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that own and guarantee $12 trillion worth of home mortgages in 2008. So what does that mean? It means that if they collapse, so does the American housing market. The real estate market, they talk about the real estate market creating. They talk about the banks failing even farther. They talk about, well, in this case, a metaphorical virus, but this kind of talking about, instead of just a national recession, talking about a global recession and what that impact could mean. So too big to fail becomes the cause of a lot of stress, a lot of trouble, and a lot of change. In the middle of all this is an election, right? We're kind of on the hinges of July, right? March, July, now we're in January. So in the middle of this economic disaster is a key election, largely because President Bush is no longer eligible for election, having served 2 terms. And what happens is that obviously in January of 2009, President Obama wins the election and is sworn in as president. He takes office at the point where the housing market index hits its all-time low. This is key. We hope at this point that there's nowhere to go but up. One of the first things he does in office is signs a second stimulus package into law. This provides $787 billion for a lot of different things, but especially tax cuts, infrastructure spending, schools, healthcare, and renewable energy. Anything that he could really do to really boost the economy, to boost support and enthusiasm for investing and spending. Again, here's another great link from the Vlogbrothers that explains kind of really how this works. And one of the things I like about this link is that they talk about Obama's stimulus plan as an honest attempt, and they say that Bush's was too. You know, the key surrounding here is that neither plan is perfect, And at this point, and even now, even 10 or 11 years later, it's too early to tell how much an impact a president like Obama had on ending the recession, having taken office only 6 months before it was declared to be over. Only time will tell. So as I said, 6 months later, we're in June. We start to see a major upward trend, which is incredible. And this really brings a formal end to the economic downturn of the Great Recession. The market begins to improve. This is where we start to see the market rebound. Kind of like that word better. And again, you start to see the housing market up. Even the housing board displays some sort of confidence that the market is going to be looking up. And I think something like this HMI forecast is reason to believe that people were generally optimistic about um, the beginning of the Obama presidency and the way that um, he handled the end of the recession, right? For even something like the housing board to look at the data and to say, yeah, I think the economic benefits of buying a house is going up. I think that's an important marker to look at in kind of assessing the president's effects on the recession. So we'll kind of talk about afterwards now, kind of moving out of this. How do we move out of this? Well, something that might have been an unforeseen cause of the Great Recession was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. And this is something that may have flown under the radar. This was actually a Depression-era law. And the whole point of the repeal, right? The major impact of the repeal allowed these large financial institutions to merge. So important that I'm going to put it in a different color. The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act allowed large financial institutions to merge, and it really creates these too big to fail institutions. Too big to fail institutions. This is maybe something that wasn't seen as dangerous at the time, but potentially enabled these companies to become too big to fail, so-called. As a result, the Dodd-Frank Act was passed in 2010, and this allowed the government to step in to assist banks that were on the brink of financial collapse. It also made more steps in preventing predatory lending, which is to look after or to go after those who are most in need of money, provide them with these absurdly high interest rates that are really impossible to pay back. So let's fast forward 10 years. And numbers-wise, we're looking at a full recovery. Numbers-wise, we've really made it out of the recession in the end. In 2018, the Dow Jones hit a record-setting point value of almost 27,000. This, of course, we know was actually topped in February of 2020, which I believe it was around 29,500. And in March of 2019, the unemployment rate hovered around 3.8%. I'm not using updated data here because I want to show this as close to the 10-year mark as possible, but I'll talk about updated stats later on at the end of the PowerPoint. Recovery from the recession, and this is something that I think is maybe the most interesting that I really hadn't considered before putting this together last year, is that recovery in the recession is really influenced by where you lived. The tech-centric, coastal, wealthy regions were the quickest to recover, and in a lot of ways, the rural communities failed to recover at all. And what this says a few things, but the biggest thing this might say, overarchingly, is that everyone felt the effects of the recession to some degree. But it's a matter of who really recovered the easiest and why the tech coastal wealthier regions. Um, Perhaps if you consider something maybe like California, right? They're obviously wealthier, so maybe they have more in savings, less in investments. Um, if you think about a place like California, you think maybe more about rentals, renting property. Rentals over mortgages. Versus contrasting that with something like the rural Rust Belt, you see more blue collar work, you see more blue collar living, you might see maybe a little more paycheck to paycheck in a lot of ways, which isn't necessarily to mean that they're poor and destitute, but they're definitely poorer, more middle class, so to speak, than the wealthier coastal areas. Um, they're definitely less wealthy. You think about these large, large swaths of land. Right? There's a lot of land ownership. So when the mortgages go under, when the banks go under, these people are hit the hardest. And in a lot of ways, 10 years later, the rural communities were still struggling to recover. Even beyond just, demographically, um, even though you see something like the housing market index increasing, there are a lot of personal scars remaining too. Um, so maybe I'll kind of include that up here. Right, investors are hesitant now, for a lot of reasons, right? They either lost everything and they're trying to earn it back, or um, you have industrial workers who are trying to still now find employees or employment. So I'll say that jobs are tricky. If you think about why, there's also been a tech boom. There's also the fear of a repeat of the recession, which in a lot of ways I think kind of connects with drawing on technology instead, right? We're not going to lose these jobs. We're not going to lose these people. We don't have to pay them if we hire robots instead. So these kind of tend to go hand in hand and starts to create somewhat of a vicious cycle. You also see a declining labor force. So maybe I'll put that down here so I don't have to write on my little housing market index. Right, there's a declining labor force. This usually is attributed to the older generations retiring. There's a changing demand for work. There's again kind of the rise in automation where possible. A lot of these like factory jobs are getting replaced by robots. Um, and looking for more higher educated workers. Right, maybe looking for a bachelor's in 5 years experience. This all kind of ties in, especially these two, with heavy risk management. Right, how can I best protect myself from this happening again? And that's kind of at the core of moving forward. If you look even beyond that at at wages, hiring starts to increase, right? There's a boom in jobs again that helps the unemployment rate go down, but wages remain stagnant. You didn't really see an increase. The 2017 median income was the same as it was in 2007, 10 years later. Um, right, this is to inflation, and that's why maybe you see a lot of people lately with higher financial strain. Even now, 2 years later, right? You look 2 years later, the median income's only gone up $4,000. That's not a lot in the scope of things. I think it's where you see a lot of people getting tighter with their budgets. In a housing um, realm, we saw almost 12% of people default on their loans at the height of the recession. The current rate is much closer to that 2005 low of about 1.5%. But despite this, buying a home still remains less popular since the recession. About 65% of homeowners actually own their home in 2019. And this is down a ways from before the recession. And all of these things on this slide really play into why there's such a hesitancy to really purchase a home and own a home and start a home. You look at all of the risks involved, and it's a big step, right? It's a big thing. So kind of our big idea here is that in some way, while the American economy recovered from the Great Recession, it adjusted disproportionately to the new sentiment toward employment, housing, and investments. This summarizes everything I said over here. Right? Investors hesitant to invest. Industrial jobs hesitant to hire people, trying to focus more on tech because of this risk management. They're trying to protect themselves from going under again. Wages have not risen proportionately to the cost of living. Hiring increases over time, but the wages remain stagnant, right? People are paying off their loans, but fewer people are buying houses. And it's kind of this whole idea of major economic events like this leave ripple effects for generations. You have the millennials, and even to some extent older Gen Z, that remember going through this, really grew up at this time, right? I kind of think about myself where I was maybe about 12 or 13 during the recession. So, I grew up, I don't remember it vividly, but I do remember it slightly. And that sticks with you. And it really informs the decisions you make financially. So where are we going from here? Well, since the recession, economists have been searching for signs of another one. How do we prepare ahead of time? We don't want to let this catch us off guard again. So they had looked at things like interest rates, auto loans, or even the housing market again. Nobody could have predicted the effects that COVID was going to have economically. You saw, obviously, part of the reason I didn't use updated statistics earlier was because they're inflated now, right? We went from 4.4% of Americans unemployed last month to 12.5%. It's an estimate, but approximately 12.5% unemployment now in April. You might have remembered that last month the Dow Jones plummeted almost 10,000 points, or more than 10,000 points in just a month, but has since recovered most of that. And even just actually a month ago, President Trump signed a bill, another stimulus package similar to the Bush and Obama ones, to provide $2 trillion in aid directly to Americans, right? Your parents may have received their stimulus checks. Came with a huge boost to unemployment assistance and the freezing of student loan debt repayment. So in a lot of ways, we're starting to see the same pattern emerge, potentially. Right? Is this what's really going on again? Well, looking at it from an economic perspective, kind of to leave us with this one quote from the former chair of the FDIC. History shows that the seeds of banking crises are sown by the decisions banks and bank policymakers make when they have maximum confidence that the horizon is clear. All this is saying is that when we expect the worst, or sorry, when we expect the best, we are unprepared for the worst. And it's interesting then living at a time where we're kind of seeing this play out in real time all over again. Where are we preparing for the worst? Are we doing what we can do, both for our health to make sure we contain the spread of coronavirus, but economically as well? What are we doing ahead of time to avoid this from happening again? Are our state legislators and our federal legislators doing kind of their job to prevent us from seeing another recession, some 12 years later from when the Great Recession occurred?